I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker. The speaker today is my wife, Lisa Barrow. She is a distinguished scholar in education research. Bachelor's is from Carleton College, PhD in economics from Princeton University. She currently works at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago and has taught at Cornell and been a research fellow at the University of Chicago. She's published widely in a variety of areas, but mainly on education research. And today she is going to talk about the expansion of high school choice in Chicago. So please join me in welcoming Lisa Barrow.
So Jonas forgot to mention that I am an economist, so I come at education from the perspective of the dismal sciences, if you want to. So thank you very much for having me. The work I'm going to talk about today is descriptive in nature, and it's part of a larger research program that is in part with Lawrence Sartain, who's at the University of Chicago at the Consortium on Chicago School Research. I'm at the Chicago Fed, but you should think of this as work that reflects our own opinions, not necessarily those of CPS or University of Chicago, although or the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago or the Federal Reserve System, but all of those parties have seen what we're doing and haven't shut us down. So anyway, so like I said, this is going to be descriptive work on the expansion of high school choice in Chicago. Chicago has had more than 30 years of public school choice. I know many of you have been around this area for a long time, and many of you may remember that in 1987, William Bennett, who was then the Secretary of Education, labeled CPS schools the worst in the nation and said parents should consider private options. And so in part, he was, at the time, about half of the high schools were at the bottom 1% of ACT test scores among high schools that gave the ACT. And that was what was cited in prompting this statement from him in the New York Times. At the time, there were 64 high schools across the city, and about 22% of 15-year-olds were enrolled in private school around that same time, 1990. Since then, there have been many policies that have been enacted to improve school quality, including some which led to increases in public high school options. Some of those you may be familiar with over the recent past are Renaissance 2010, which focused on both closing and opening new schools at both high school and elementary school levels. It encouraged some charter school development. There was also the CHSRI, which was the Chicago Small High School Initiative, which was in part a Gates Foundation push to create small high schools, and sometimes this was breaking up a large high school into smaller high schools. Sometimes they were purposely created to be small, and so that was one of the policies that's happened, and several others that happened under Arne Duncan, who was our recent past Secretary of Education. So today, there are 138 high schools in the city of Chicago, and in spite of Bill Bennett's statement in 1987, only 12% of 15-year-olds enrolled in private school, roughly, currently. So over this period, there was a large expansion in exercising choice, or in school choice, but not the rise in private school enrollment that maybe Mr. Bennett would have thought we might see. So over this time period, so I'm going to focus on the most recent 15 years of data that we have available. We have data going back a little further, but 15 seemed like a nice round number. So over this time period, the percentage of first-time ninth grade students who are attending choice school has risen steadily, pretty much. In 2002, roughly 50% of students attended their assigned neighborhood high school. And a choice school is any public school outside of that choice. And in 2016, roughly 75%, only 25% attended their neighborhood high school. So roughly 75% of first-time ninth grade students were attending a choice school in Chicago, a public choice school. There are many arguments that are in favor of school choice, and there's some that are opposed, and we're going to use these sort of as our framework for what do we look at in this piece of work. One of the arguments is that you get a better match between students and schools or families. So you might think within a family you have kids that are interested in different things, like one kid who's really science and tech oriented, one kid who's more arts oriented. You could stay in the same house and send your kids to different high schools if you have that flexibility of not having to pick a neighborhood high school for both your kids. So you can do that without opting for private school, without moving to the suburbs. So that's one argument in favor of choice. Another argument is creating more racially integrated schools. So in Chicago and many other cities, magnet schools, which are a choice school, were created to, in order to work toward desegregating public schools. Another common thing that many economists talk about is improving school quality through competition. So if schools have to compete for the money that comes with a student, that they're going to either become more efficient or the less efficient schools will close and more efficient schools will survive because they attract students because they are doing a good job. Now, the fact is that there's mixed empirical evidence on whether academic outcomes are better at particular types of choice schools. For example, there's some work that my co-author and I, as well as in Chicago and other authors in New York and Boston, that shows that in terms of academic outcomes, there really isn't any value added in these highly selective exam schools. And there's mixed evidence on charter schools. Sometimes some cities like Boston have found charter schools performing better than the public schools that the kids are coming from, and other areas have found charter schools doing no better or worse. In terms of opposition to school choice, one of the arguments is, the increased uncertainty for students, families, and even schools. If you live in Chicago and you read any of the education blogs, or if you read the Tribune, there's a lot of anxiety in the time leading up to high school enrollment, where kids are worried about their test scores and their grades and where they're going to get in because of there not being a sure path from where you go to elementary school and where you go to high school unless you go to your neighborhood assigned high school. There's also the argument that there's disparate access to good schools. So if the system of exercising choice is complex, maybe only kids from high-income, high-functioning families are able to navigate the process. So that's one of the concerns, or that it's pulling resources away from neighborhood schools and leaving other kids behind. There are concerns about increased segregation. So some districts, they've shown that in other countries, that when you add more schools, it leads to people, sorting in ways that can increase segregation either racially or by income and ability. And finally, a really direct effect of not going to your neighborhood school is potentially increased time spent commuting. In Chicago, which is a very, large footprint geographically, if you were traveling from the far south side of the city to the far north side of the city, you could spend quite a bit of time on the bus. So let's get to talking about what the options are in Chicago. So Chicago is considered an open enrollment district, and what that means is that in this case, there's a neighborhood high school with an attendance boundary that assigns every residence to a high school. So that's the default for students. If you don't apply anywhere you can walk in on the first day of school at your neighborhood high school. There are other citywide schools, and I say other because I'll talk about the selective high schools, but these citywide schools, some of them are career academies that have very specific like career and technical education foci, like on, they could be on medical sciences, it could be on something more, more vocationally oriented, more like a traditional VOTAC type education. There are magnet schools, which are the traditional schools that have had a focus to attract students with a particular interest. It could be arts or sciences or something like that. Then there are military schools that have sort of a leadership focus in training, and they are associated with the different armed services. And those citywide high schools all tend to have like admission requirements, like a minimum test scores and some sort of achievement-related admission criteria. And then we have charter high schools, which are not supposed to have any admission criteria. They do require you to apply to them, and they're supposed to allocate seats based on lottery. If more students apply, then they have space to enroll. And then we have the selective enrollment high schools, which part of our research was focused more on the selective high schools. So a lot of times, we talk about those as a separate thing. They are supposed to be designed for the highest achieving students in the district to provide, a college preparation that might not be available to them in their neighborhood school. They rely on prior performance measures like grades and test scores, and they require students to take an entrance exam, and then they admit the highest scoring students in terms of an application score. With currently they reserve seats based on neighborhood socioeconomic status. So in addition to all of these different types of schools, there are also specialized programs within schools. So neighborhood high schools can have international baccalaureate programs, they can have fine arts programs, they can have career and technical education programs, which is what CTE stands for. And those can vary in, like, if you look at Lakeview High School, they have a STEM program that's open to all neighborhood students, but it's a lottery program for anyone outside the neighborhood. And then there's schools like Senn that have an international baccalaureate program, and everyone who's interested has to apply that program. If you're a neighborhood student, you're not necessarily admitted to the IB diploma program. Now, they also have IB school, wall-to-wall IB, which is more about classes and not about a diploma program. But there are all sorts of programs, and what it means in the end is that an 8th grader in 2016, looking at high school, had more than 300 potential programs when you count the programs and the school combinations. So it can be a daunting task for any family, let alone a 14, 15-year-old who's trying to make a decision about high school. Okay, so in terms of where these schools are located, I'm not sure how well the colors show up on here, not very well, I think, but we're going to focus on the 4 types of schools because we can't identify separate programs that students are enrolled in. And the reason for this map was to show that really these schools of types are spread across the city. Now, of course, there's some like the extreme southeast and northwest don't have a lot of schools located in them. That's O'Hare off to the really far left. So not surprising they don't put one in the middle of the runways. But by and large, there is a sort of impression you get reading the popular press that charter schools are only opening on the west and south side, say. But there are charter high schools all over the city. There are neighborhood high schools all over the city, not surprisingly. But there are also they've made a point of opening selective high schools across the city, and other citywide programs exist as well. Okay, so when we look at what's happened to the numbers of schools of these types over time, in 2002, most schools were neighborhood high schools. And that count of schools has not changed very much. There's some fluctuation in the middle. Some of that was this small school movement where you broke schools up, so you had 4 schools in one building, and then you reconstitute the school as a single school, so there's some movement there. There's been a slight expansion in the number of other citywide programs and selective programs, but really the big expansion has been in charter schools. So in 2002, there were 7 charter high schools in the district, and in 2016, there are 47. So that's accounted for a lot of this explosion in the number of high schools going on. So in terms of what's going on in the background to keep in mind in the city is a falling population. So on the left-hand side, I have the population of 15-year-olds in Chicago over time, and I'm showing you the race makeup, broken down into Latino, Black, African American, and other. And then on the right-hand side is what the Chicago Public School first-time ninth graders look like. And so focusing on the ninth graders, the enrollment peaked in about 2009, and it's declined about 12% over that time. And you can see that on the population, that's declined much more steeply than the first-time ninth graders. These are on the same scale, so I didn't just make it look steeper. But what you can tell among both populations, is that Latinos are now a higher percentage of the population than they were historically, and Black and African American students are making up a smaller proportion. So it used to be about 50% African American students, and now it's about 50% Latino students. So they've sort of flipped shares of the student body. And the decline in enrollment in Chicago public schools can be entirely explained by the decline in enrollment among African American students. So there's been a lot of talk about exit of African Americans from the city and moving to the suburbs. And so, today the public high school population based on first-time ninth grade enrollment is 47% Latino, 38% Black African American, and 14% other. The majority of the other is white, but that includes Asian and any other, like Native American, mix, if someone reports their race as mixed. So those are important things to keep in mind in the background as you're expanding school choice. This is what's going on, because I will show you things by race that you have to keep in mind that the background population is changing as well. But I'll help you with that. All right, so here, now we're just looking at enrollment by school type. So I showed you that the big expansion was in charter schools. And so now if you look at where students are enrolling, and I should say that reason 2007 is missing from a lot of these charts that I'll show is that for that year, there was a change in the data system, and we don't know what your neighborhood high school was, that assignment. So we just dropped that year from times where we distinguish between whether it's your own assigned high school or a different neighborhood high school. So you can see that in 2002, roughly 50%, I told you earlier, were attending their neighborhood high school, and that drops to 25% in 2016. And instead, 25% of students are attending a charter high school. So that's expansion of charters has really dominated the increase in school choice that's been going on. There's also been a slight increase in enrollment at selective high schools as the number of selectives has expanded. And those increases in enrollment shares have really come at the cost of neighborhood and the others, a little bit from the other citywide programs. So who is it that's exercising choice? So we talked about some of the concerns about disparity of access. If we look at choice by just race groups, on the left-hand side, I'm showing you what the conditional on being African American, what percent were enrolling in different types of schools, and then in 2016, for that same race or ethnicity, what was the breakdown? And what we see is for all race groups, there's been an increase in exercise of choice. African American students are the least likely to attend their assigned neighborhood school. In fact, a higher share of African Americans attend a charter school than any neighborhood high school, either their own or another neighborhood high school program. So charter schools have been really important as a mechanism for electing out of your neighborhood school among African American students. I think it's interesting to note that among other students, the choice expansion has really been in the selective high school category. But, across the board, all students have increased choosing outside of their neighborhood school, and all students have increased in charter and selective high schools. So the next breakdown is on, I thought it was supposed to be on income, but I guess it's on prior achievement. So this breaks down the population of students into quartiles. So 25% of students are in each horizontal bar, and showing who, where those students are going. And not surprisingly, a district that has a lot of schools that have some sort of minimum criteria for admission, the highest achieving students are the most likely to attend a school outside their neighborhood high school. And almost half of the highest quartile students in 2016 are attending one of these selective enrollment high schools. There's also a lot of choice going on in the bottom quartile of achieving, but they're disproportionately attending the charter schools, which by itself is interesting because a lot of times the concern is that charter schools are cream skimming and taking the best students out of the neighborhood high schools. But we'll look at that in another way also. And the largest increase in exercising choice is for that lowest achieving student category. So then the next one is by neighborhood income, and here we just divide up the census tracts in the city by the students by the, it's a combination of actually family income and male employment rates. And it's a measure that's put together by the consortium. And so 25% of the students are in each category. And what we see here is that students from the lowest income neighborhoods are also the most likely to exercise choice, which is suggestive of there being a lot of school choice through location still existing. In spite of it being a choice district, the highest income students are the most likely, or one of the two quartiles are the most likely to choose their neighborhood school, but they may have chosen where they live because of what the neighborhood high school is. So low income students are, the least likely to attend their neighborhood high school. So what does this mean for the school district? So I was just telling you the decisions that students are making, but then we can look at a school type and see, well, then what does their makeup look like when they get to that school? And so I will look at these same categories, but across the different types of schools. And so these first two types are the neighborhood high schools and the other city-wide high schools, and I'm looking at the racial mix of the category of schools, not the individual schools, but I'll get to showing you stuff about individual schools as well. So not surprisingly, neighborhood schools shifted toward being higher percent Latino because I showed you that the city, by and large, is becoming a higher percentage Latino, although it's shifted more in that direction than the city population. Other citywide high schools have also shifted in that direction. There's been a large decline in the percent of African American at other citywide high schools. The charter high schools, again, look, they're shifting in the direction that the population is shifting, but you can see, very few students who are in the other race category are choosing charter high schools. And most interesting for me is that the selective high schools have actually increased overall in the share that's Black or Latino, African American or Latino, because there was a shift in the enrollment policy. So I mentioned just in passing that selective schools have reserved seats for based on neighborhood socioeconomic status. They used to do things based on race until they lifted the consent decree in Chicago, and race could no longer be used as a determinant in admission. And so they were trying really hard not to undo all of the progress made toward integration. And so they adopted policies that weighted different socioeconomic characteristics other than race to determine like slots reserved rather than reserving slots for white and other. And so we have not seen you might have thought that the percent white would go up once you took away that limit on the number of or other students, but in fact it went down. So that's interesting to me. So then this is looking at prior achievement. So neighborhood high schools as a whole doesn't look like there's been a big shift over time. I think this is interesting because lately I've been hearing a lot of people complain about neighborhood schools losing resources and the implication that they're getting stuck with students who are not as high achieving because the high achieving students are going off to selective and other citywide programs. In fact, the other citywide programs are looking slightly less high achieving than they used to. Charter high schools, by and large, they're pulling from the lowest part of the distribution in terms of prior achievement. And even the selective high schools have become a little bit less dominated by that highest achieving category. I should mention two things with this. One is if there's a program at a selective high school that's not selective but is housed in the same school, we can't tell it, we can just tell the school. So if there's been any increase there, that could affect this. But I think this was also probably part of the shift in admissions policy from reserving seats based on race to reserving seats based on income. And so possibly the correlation between SES and prior achievement test scores leads to a slightly lower share of the highest achieving category.
Just for clarification, when you say prior achievement, you're talking about the achievement of students prior to some grade level?
It's 8th grade. So what they look like before they came into the high school.
What their achievement
Yeah.
in terms of grades?
Test score. So, okay, then this last group is by income. Once again, the neighborhood high schools as a whole look very similar distribution-wise to what they look like in 2002. If anything, they're a little bit shifted in the positive direction in terms of higher income. Other citywide high schools have shifted a bit in the other direction. Charter schools, by and large, are drawing from the lowest income neighborhoods. And the selective high schools, again, probably consistent with the change in admissions policy, shifted slightly to a higher representation among students from the lowest income neighborhoods. So the things that I showed you were across school type, and so that can mask anything that's going on at the individual school level, because you could have perfect segregation within a category. Race itself increased choice has an uncertain effect on what happens with segregation. I told you earlier, other studies have suggested that segregation may increase. But we also know Chicago is very residentially segregated, and so Chicago has traditionally relied on choice as a way to help integrate schools. So what I'm going to show you is how the race distribution looks like at every school in the district. And so the 2002 has fewer schools than the 2016 figure, so that's why it looks a little bit less color dense. And these are sorted by the percent of students who are Black or African American. And the thing that really stands out to me is just how many schools have virtually no racial diversity at all. So in 2002, 31 out of 76 high schools, or 40% of high schools, were at least 90% African American, and 4%, which is 3 high schools at the time, were at least 90% Latino. In 2016, only 30% of the high schools are at least 90% African American, but it's still 30%, and 15 schools were at least 90% Latino. So, Latino population increased as a whole, or as a share, and we see some increase in the share of schools that are virtually all Latino. So what that meant from the student perspective is that 54% of African American students attended a high school that was at least 90% African American, and 24% of Latino students attend a high school that's at least 90% Latino. So schools are highly segregated in Chicago. But how has that changed? So we use what's called a Tile index. So Tile is a statistician. He's deceased, I believe. Theil is his name. And this is a multi-group measure of segregation where effectively you're comparing the race makeup of each school to what does the overall distribution of the district look like, and then weighting that up across all the schools. And that way, even though the underlying distribution has changed in Chicago, we can get an idea of how segregation has changed across the high schools. So the multi-group is, I'm only considering 3 groups: African American, Latino, and other. And the observed column is what I'm going to focus on right now. And so we can see that, it's gone up a little bit. So if you have a 0, that means every school looks like the district as a whole. So you have complete integration at 0. At 100, the way I've scaled it, you have complete segregation. Every school is only a single race category. So we've seen a slight increase, but on a scale of 0 to 100, this is not much of all. So we haven't seen a large increase in segregation associated with this period of increasingly available choice and increasingly exercised choice. Then the next 2 groups, I have created just a 2-group version. So you have African American students versus anybody else, and Latino students versus anybody else. And by comparing the 2015-16 numbers across these 2 groups, we can see that African American students are more highly segregated than Latino students, which isn't surprising given what I showed you about the number of high schools that are highly African American. And then the last thing we do is create a counterfactual measure where we say, what if everyone attended their neighborhood high school, their assigned neighborhood high school? And that, there are a couple of caveats with that. One is that it assumes people wouldn't make different residential choices if there was no school choice available. It also assumes that the capacity of the existing neighborhood high schools could accommodate all of the students, which isn't true. So, you'd have to replicate neighborhood high schools in the exact same way. So if everyone attended their neighborhood high school, we would actually see slightly higher segregation across all 3 of these measures, whether I'm looking at the multi-group or the African American students or Latino students. So there isn't a lot of evidence from Chicago that choices had a big effect on, a negative effect on integration. Okay, so what about achievement? So the other thing when you have schools that are basing admissions decisions on prior achievement is you can increase the sorting across schools on achievement. So what I've done in this picture is every school is one of these box plots. And if you remember your box plots, like I think the first box is like the plus and minus 25% of the distribution or something like that, and the bar in the middle is the median. These have been sorted based on the average for the high school. So in the 2002 category and the 2016 category, the lowest performing school is a neighborhood high school, and the highest performing school is a selective high school, but not necessarily the same schools. One thing that it may not be as obvious as if you're looking it up close is that basically the achievement, this is again 8th grade achievement, so it's about the students, what the students look like before they get to the high school. It is shifted up across all of these schools by about 16 points on this scale, and that's about 0.9 of a standard deviation. So that's a big change. So basically, based on prior achievement, the average high school is getting better performing kids across the board. What we would see in this picture if there was a lot of sorting that was obvious is, that the line would be steeper, the difference between the top and the bottom would be bigger, and the whiskers on the box plots would collapse in because the distributions would be tighter. But to analyze this slightly more formally, we just run a regression where we see how much of the variation in test scores can be explained just by the high school that's attended. We see a slight increase in this R-squared measure of explaining overall variation in test scores. We do it also by neighborhood income category because that's one of the ways that they've changed the admissions profiles. And here we see, the highest income students, they exhibit the most sorting by ability, and it's basically monotonically increasing across neighborhood income quartile. But the biggest change between 2002 and 2016 has been among the lowest income students. And finally, I mentioned one of the arguments for increasing school choice is a better matching between students and schools. Maybe you as a parent are able to find a high school in the city that you'd send your kid to rather than opting for private or going to the suburbs. The light green line with triangles on this figure shows what percent of 8th grade students are exiting CPS. And we see that it's declined pretty steadily since 2002. And that's suggestive that parents and students within CPS are more likely to find a high school that they feel comfortable sending their kids to. Now, at the same time, you might have thought that meant there was also an increased entry into the system. We don't see that. We also see a declining share of students entering, but it hasn't declined at the same rate. And so they're about the same, and I do it as a percentage of the same cohort so that it is literally the same number of students. And so what that means is now, it used to be there was this big drop in cohort size between 8th grade and 9th grade, and now that has basically flattened out. So the number of 8th graders that exist in CPS is very highly predictive of the number of 9th graders you're going to have. And I think this might be finally, I mentioned that one of the direct consequences of increased choice is that students are potentially traveling a lot further to high school. So in this table, we present, in the first row, I just have the distance to your assigned high school, which has increased a little bit over that period. But then the next row is the distance to the high school you actually attend. So in 2002, people lived a little less than 1.5 miles from their assigned high school, but they were traveling twice that distance on average to go to high schools because they were going to high schools that were about 3 miles away. That has increased. So in 2016, there's traveling almost 2/3 of a mile further. And these are crow flies distances, not travel distance. And then below that distance to high school attended, I broke it up based on where you're attending. So once again, if you're attending your neighborhood high school, it's about 1.3 miles from your home to your high school. But every other choice takes you from between 4 miles and 6 miles currently to travel on average. And you can see that some of the distances have gone up a little, like other neighborhood high school. Kids are traveling a little bit further. Charter high school, kids are traveling 0.4 miles further. What's driving up the overall average is really this increase in exercise of choice. Not that the schools, but by definition, when you added more schools kind of distributed across the city, people live closer to some school than they used to, but because so many people have increased their exercise of choice, the overall average distance traveled is going up. So that's a direct cost of increasing choice. So just to wrap up, there's been we show that there's been a large increase in the number of public school options in Chicago, and a steady increase in the share of students attending a choice high school over this period. African American students and students living in the poorest neighborhoods are the most likely to attend a choice school. So when people say we should not allow charters or we should not allow choice, they're talking about shutting down choice for some of the most disadvantaged students in the city. It's also true that high achieving students are likely to attend a choice high school. And a direct consequence of this increase in choice has been an increase in the average distance traveled. Perhaps surprisingly, sorting across schools has changed little with the increase. We see a small increase in sorting based on prior achievement, especially for students from low-income areas of the city, but no dramatic increase in racial segregation. But the big caveat is that CPS is still highly segregated. There's no question. So is the city. But maybe there are signs of progress. I don't know. And also that a growing share of CPS 8th graders are subsequently enrolling in a CPS high school. So just in terms of some other discussion we include, so this is a forthcoming Economic Perspectives article from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, so you can read a full piece on it sometime next month, I think. So the evidence from Chicago is that there's significant demand for high school choice, and that's true. So choice has been, obviously it's a big policy discussion on the forefront of education policy discussions at the national level. Choice is not likely to go away because we have a pretty high demand for it, and so there are a lot of constituents who have a stake in maintaining choice. However, in Chicago, this expansion of choice has happened in an era of declining enrollment. CPS traditionally has been reluctant to close high schools. One of the concerns given is that kids have to cross gang lines to attend a different high school, and even in closing elementary schools, which they closed 50 schools, is it 3 years now, I think? There were lots of concerns about the safety of kids getting to school. And so that has been a reluctance in Chicago. It's been a problem in other countries that have invoked a lot of open enrollment school choice, that closing schools that aren't attracting a lot of students is not popular and gets avoided. You can pick it up, it's okay, Katie. But the reality is that I forgot to tell you, but as choices increased and neighborhood schools have declined in enrollment, that some schools are operating with fewer than 50 students in 9th grade, and it makes it very hard for a high school to offer a comprehensive program with so few students, especially when you fund schools on a student-based budgeting system, because you only have, if you only have like 6 classes or 2 classrooms worth of math students in 9th grade, you might not be able to offer algebra and geometry and calculus and whatever. So I think it's really likely that CPS is going to have to close schools over the next several years, and that it's costly to students, but it's costly to leave them open as well. And so I think it's a reality that we face going forward. So thank you.
Chicago, I think, spends less money apparently compared to suburban schools. Is there any correlation money spent to the achievements of the students?
There are lots of studies that have shown that money matters. Clearly, how you spend the money matters too. But even if you equalize spending between Winnetka and Chicago, I don't think you would expect to see equalized outcomes for students, because the students in Chicago, by and large, are much more disadvantaged than the students in Winnetka. So, you know, we have a lot of compensatory funding in education from federal money, like Title I money, but I think it's hard to undo what parents bring to the table. And so my kids are in a CPS elementary school, and it's a good example of how hard it is to do things like equalized funding, because the parents at our school can raise $500,000 to pay for an art teacher and a music teacher and, you know, whatever else I can't even think. I'm on the LSC committee and I do budget stuff, so I should be able to tell you what they spend it all on. But, you know, professional development for the teachers, or, you know, what? Reducing class size, any of those things. So I should say that over that period, we didn't talk about how the schools are doing, but the schools have improved over that time in terms of higher graduation rates, lower dropout rates, and test scores. So everyone in Chicago up until this past year took the ACT in 11th grade. And so while dropout rates were declining, ACT scores were rising. So it's not just that that you were losing the bottom performing students. So.
Is there a larger context for you doing work for a private bank on one school system as opposed to maybe a national issue? Is there a larger context?
So so first of all, I work for the Federal Reserve Bank, which isn't really a private bank, but I'm in the research department there. And the reason we're focused on Chicago is because we live here and we care a lot about the Chicago public schools. I think Chicago also often offers in spite of what you might think about Chicago, in many of the things that have happened nationally in schools, Chicago's been on the leading edge a bit. So this holding schools accountable and shutting down underperforming schools was done in a way that was not dissimilar to No Child Left Behind and the sanctions that were put on schools in that. And it started before that time, so people have used the experience from Chicago to think about what these things might mean for the nation. So we focus on Chicago because we have access to the data, and we're here and we care about the Chicago schools. This is part of a larger Chicago research agenda, but we're not being paid to do research on it, although we do have a grant funding some of it.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's just, you know, it's a rich diet to get it in 45 minutes. Yeah. I'm wondering about the community-based schools that offer so many after-school and evening activities for families in the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. What happens when fewer and fewer kids are in neighborhood-based high schools to that community sense that families who need to learn English or get job training skills, learn about computers or something like that, don't have anywhere to go?
I think that's an important point, and I don't know what the answer is. I don't know, actually, in terms of some of those programs, there are different organizations fund those programs, so those don't tend to be funded through, you know, they're not generally public. There are some public school funded programs, but I don't know how much community organizations that are running some of those programs have taken it upon themselves to sort of maintain that sort of program, but I don't know the answer.
If I understood correctly, you mentioned that for your public school, the one that your children are going to, you've raised money along with other parents and contributed that to your local public school, and then they can make use of those funds?
Yeah, so there are many of the, I would say probably mostly higher income schools, but they would be, any school can have a Friends of organization. They usually, I say Friends of because they're nonprofit organizations, often called something like Friends of Abraham Lincoln Elementary, or Friends of Lincoln Elementary, I guess, Friends of Alcott, Friends of Oscar Mayer, Friends of Peyton. And these organizations raise money for the schools. They do not, so in our school, and I think this is probably generally true, they don't not dictate how the money is spent. That is determined based on, but that how the spending goes is determined by the principal and the local school council. But the local school council can make a request for the Friends of organization to raise money for a particular purpose. And there's no, as far as I know, there are no restrictions in CPS about what the money can be spent on. I'm sure it does. I do know that I think my co-author and someone else, who I can't remember who she's working with, are trying to collect that information from the tax forms on those Friends of organizations to learn something about that.
Thank you. I was wondering, do you know the racial makeup of the 12% that are going to private schools?
Yes. So I pulled that information from census data, so I can't remember now. It's probably buried in a footnote in the paper, but I know that part of that change in the demographics of the district relative to the city is in part a change in who's attending private school versus public school. There are a fair number of African American kids attending private schools. I think the share of Latinos attending private schools is relatively low. But I think the share of other race students is relatively high. But
I'm sorry, would you have an opinion on how vouchers would affect the Chicago public school system?
Vouchers it depends entirely on whether it's a targeted voucher program, a universal voucher program. I think a voucher program could be very expensive for Chicago, given that to the extent you draw back in 12% of students that you're currently not paying for, it doesn't really solve the money problem because it would be financed with the same dollars. So I think voucher programs, they're not the cure that many people would like you to think they are. And I think they would create, many of the same problems that increased choice does for the schools that become less popular.
Is there choice in the elementary and middle school landscape?
Yes. So most schools in Chicago are either elementary or high schools. We don't have many that are dedicated middle schools, although there are some of these high schools, particularly some of the selective schools have these programs that start in grade 7. And so there's a 7-8, it's a 6-year high school program basically. But yes, there are magnet elementary schools. There are these, they're called classical schools that are that some of our Sunday school students attend. There are gifted schools that are they're regional gifted programs. There are gifted programs that are specifically for native Spanish-speaking kids. There are, I'm sure that probably covers it for elementary school. We don't do career and technical education that early. And then there are a few oddball programs that have like different enrollment. Like I think Sharon's kids were at one of the schools that only goes to 6th grade, and then you're stuck having to find a school for 7th grade for sure. And then like there are these there are some of these IB middle years programs that people can apply to.
I've been out of the educational field for a number of years now, so I don't know the answer to this question. You sort of just addressed it. I was curious, can you address what is the status of gifted education in the city of Chicago?
They test 4-year-olds for gifted education, and they decide who's gifted at 4. And basically it stays. Now you can apply, slots do open up because sometimes people, leave schools. But to me it seems a little bit early to determine the life path of a kid. But no, that's what I know about gifted education in Chicago. They say things like they're teaching 2 years above grade level, which to me, that doesn't sound like what gifted is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be you go at the same rate, just starting, to me it seems like there should be more depth or more, you progress further, I don't know. But anyway, that's what I know.
Is there any data out there about how testing children at 4 years old
How predictive
reflects more of a socioeconomic situation rather than any future educational, possibility?
That's a good question, and I don't really know the answer to that.
One of the things you showed that I thought was very interesting was the entry and exit 8th to 9th grade, because I sort of thought the story about the selective enrollment schools 15 years ago was to stem the tide of people leaving the city to Oak Park or Evanston or whatever. And so is there information elsewhere? Is it asymmetrical? Are people quicker to leave when they think the schools are bad than they are to come back if they think the schools are good? Do we know that from anywhere else?
I don't know if we know. I haven't seen research on that. I know we looked a little bit at, in selective, if you get in, if you don't get in, does that mean you're more likely to leave? And it's sort of interesting the way the selection works on the selective margin, because it's not the best students. It seems like the students who are likely to leave the district if they don't get into a selective tend to be more negatively selected. So that means that they're not as high achieving. It's interesting. So there's this mix of opinions. There's this feeling that they were to stem the tide of people leaving. But now you hear people I don't know if it's your alderman, but some of the aldermen are saying, but we need to invest in our neighborhood high schools because people are fleeing to the suburbs for high school because they can't get into the selectives and we don't have a good neighborhood option. So I don't think there is strong evidence that is going on, but it's sort of it's like if you do one thing, they're going to say, it's like the same complaint over time about public education. The schools are terrible. They've been saying it for 120 years, so.
In trying to improve the education of all students, do you ever involve high school students themselves in coming up with plans and evaluating plans made and figuring out ways to make things better?
I don't know. I know that they do. So I am not a qualitative researcher, but people who do at the consortium who do qualitative research on some of these issues definitely, talk to students about their experiences, say with school closures at the elementary level, what was it like to be displaced from your school and be enrolled in a new school? I also know that there have been experiments, you might have read recently in the Tribune, there have been experiments with, I think it's called competency-based evaluation. I can't remember the term exactly, but so there's been this debate about whether seat time is important. So everyone sits through algebra class and they all go through at the same pace because you're teaching a classroom of students. And so there's been a movement to experiment in Illinois and in some schools in Chicago specifically about, if you're ready to pass algebra on the first day of algebra class, you can take a test and pass algebra and move on to something else. So a more So in that way, a more student-driven education for the individual student, because the education itself is somewhat more individualized. So that isn't specifically what you were asking about, because they're not talking about policy, but it is more of a student-driven education experiment.
I noticed the achievement levels for the charter schools versus the regular schools was about the same. Given the fact that I believe the charter schools operate on less stringent policies, do they need less money to teach the same student? And if so, would that be a added value since you're spending,
Is the quality of teaching different from neighborhood to charter to selective? And are teachers held to a higher standard in the selective versus the charter versus the neighborhood?
The principal is supposed to have the control over the teachers they hire. And that certainly different student bodies are going to attract interest of different teachers and the quality of the principal you can place at the school. And I suspect that selective enrollment high schools are viewed as more prestigious placements than a neighborhood high school for a principal. I'm not sure, but I can imagine that's true. So there could be a difference in teaching. I know that what we find in some of our research on the selective high schools is that students report better relationships with teachers on average at the selectives over the non-selectives. There are better relationships between peers. The students report safer environment, personal safety is better. The teachers report better safety. But I don't know, I don't know about evaluating the actual, I don't have data on the what's actually going on in the classroom and whether the teachers are better on average that way. So.
Hi, I'm one of those who believe that the movement for selective enrollment schools, especially charter schools, are kind of a stalking horse for privatization of the public school system. And I'm especially fearful with the new education secretary. Could you comment on Betsy DeVos and what her agenda is?
So I think her agenda, so I don't know, I haven't spent a lot of time studying her agenda, but my understanding is that she is very motivated to have religious education, and I don't think she actually knows that much about education specifically, or the evidence that exists for or against different models of education. So I don't know where she's going with us. The good news is that most funding for education is state and local funding, so the federal government is a relatively small share and presumably can have relatively small influence. Not that it hasn't had big influence in the past, but...
About the term charter school, does that mean chartered by the authority of some outside organization? What does charter school mean?
So the charter is granted by Chicago Public Schools in Chicago. It differs from state to state, depending on the law. In Michigan, like universities charter schools, and I can't remember who else in the state does, but so the district, CPS, has the right to revoke the charter, except if the state committee on charter schools overrules their decision, and CPS has tried to shut down charter schools that the state has said, no, you can't. It is driven by CPS.
Can you talk about the Moving to Opportunity program and what your stuff says about that?
So Moving to Opportunity was this program that moved kids out of neighborhoods of high poverty to neighborhoods. They basically, the families got vouchers to get housing in neighborhoods that were below a certain poverty level. And so they were coming from extremely high poverty neighborhoods to lower poverty neighborhoods. The work that I've done in Chicago is going to be, to the extent, and there were positive benefits on kids in the long run of some of these shifts. Now, one would expect, I think on the surface, one would expect that any effect of selective enrollment schools taking kids from poor neighborhoods to schools, attending schools with higher income kids would have a smaller impact than any moving to opportunity program, because it only affects your school life and is not affecting where you're living, is not affecting potentially the opportunities that your family, parents, whatever, have access to. On the other hand, it's also not having any sort of socially isolating throughout your whole life effect that maybe moving to opportunity was, because I know a lot of people ended up moving back. So, so I'm not sure that there are direct comparisons to be drawn, but we don't actually find that so in my selective enrollment research, we thought that attending a selective high school might be much more important for a high-achieving kid from Englewood, say, than for a high-achieving kid from Lincoln Park, because the parents in Lincoln Park can invest more in their kids if they're not in a great high school because they have more income, or they have access to a good neighborhood high school, or a high-performing neighborhood high school, or whatever. And in fact, we don't find that it makes, academically, it doesn't seem to matter for the kids, except for that they get the kids on the margin, regardless of whether you're from a higher income neighborhood or a lower income neighborhood. If you just get into a selective versus just don't get in, you have a lower GPA. And so there are negative effects of getting into a selective if you're close to the bottom in terms of getting in. And the one thing that we found for kids from lower income neighborhoods is that while they're no less likely to go to college, they're less likely to go to a selective college. And that's, we use Barron's rating of 4 or higher as our definition, 4 or lower, I guess, on the rate 1 through 4. And so that school's, University of Illinois is a selective college in that sort of metric. We're not just talking about Harvard. And that's concerning because kids who attend selective colleges are more likely to graduate and persist in college than if you attend a non-selective school.
So you just addressed my question a little bit. I'm curious about how, if you have much data on after graduation outcomes and how the school choice has affected both the college preparation and going to more selective colleges, but also economic outcomes as well.
So I first of all should say that we don't have good causal evidence on choice, this increase in choice and the improvements in outcomes. So it's correlational. That it's certainly worth more study, but we don't have a good identification strategy for telling what's coming from increased choice. What we know is that students are more likely to enroll in a 4-year college after graduation, and they're more likely to persist. We don't have economic outcomes further on. So that's not my own research. That's some work out of the consortium that showed that Chicago public school students have these improved outcomes.
Actually, I think we need to bring it to an end. So thank you very much,
Well,
Lisa.
thank you very much. I'll be around.